We're going to do a little series talking about biases and fallacies. I'm going to do one bias or one fallacy per video so I can go as deep or as shallow as seems appropriate. If you're interested in something specific, put that down in the comments and we'll see if we can do a video about the thing you want to talk about. Up front, it's worth saying that we're kind of built out of biases. We are meat computers, and as a result, for evolutionary reasons, we have taken a lot of shortcuts. We have made simplifications in the way that we view the world. We tend to jump to conclusions. We tend to hold on to decisions, even against outside forces, in a lot of ways because that's what helped us survive. You don't want to spend that extra couple of seconds to figure out if that thing moving in the bushes is a tiger or not, if it could be a tiger. As we have moved off of the savannah and become members of a society, these biases have remained, some of them hardwired into our genetics, into the way that our brain works. And that's okay. The thing that really we need to do is be aware that these biases exist, be aware that they can make us make bad decisions, they can make us interact with the world and with other people in bad ways, and try to use that knowledge to at least take a second look, at least in the cases when there isn't a tiger in the bush. Most of the time these days, when we are interacting with someone online or in person or making decisions, the urgency of those decisions are not at the microsecond or second level. They are at the hour, day, year, month, lifetime level of time frame. So taking that extra bit of time to consider our own biases, to consider the biases of the people that we're interacting with, allow us to hopefully make better, more equitable decisions. We're going to start off with something that is really common in the video game industry, which is the anchor bias. The anchor bias is our tendency to overvalue the first piece of information that we get on a topic, especially when it's numerical. If you see an object that costs $500, then that's what you kind of think that this sort of thing costs. And then when you see it for $250, you think, wow, what a steal. And retailers use this to trick us into thinking we're getting bargains by overpricing things and then marking them down. So where do we see this in the video game industry? In a lot of different places, but a couple of that, in my experience, sales projections. One of the reasons why I think it is vitally important for game teams to try to get ahead of their sales projections within larger publishing organizations is because of the anchor bias. This happened on Dragon Age Inquisition. For pretty much the entirety of the development of that project, I was fighting against a very low sales projection set by the sales team because of anchor bias. They had decided, in part based upon the sales of Dragon Age 2, that Dragon Age Inquisition wasn't going to sell super well. It's going to sell like 2-3 million copies. And it didn't matter what additional evidence was provided to them. That number never really changed significantly. You were always dealing with incremental improvements as opposed to a reevaluation of the actual sales projection from the ground up. And that's the anchor bias in a nutshell, is they were overvaluing the piece of information that they had up front, the sales of Dragon Age 2, and no amount of new additional information would change that to any significant degree. So you're fighting against this massive amount of momentum in the case of an anchor bias, because we naturally tend to value that first piece of information so much more. And you can see the seduction of the anchor bias here, because using Dragon Age 2 as a starting point for sales of Dragon Age Inquisition makes a lot of sense, because it's a Dragon Age game, it's the previous Dragon Age game, so why wouldn't you start there and then build your estimates as fractional changes upon that starting number? Well, because Dragon Age Inquisition is a fundamentally different thing than Dragon Age 2, so you can't get there by adding 5% to the sales, 10% to the sales, over and over and over again. There's no amount of change that gets you from Dragon Age 2 to Dragon Age Inquisition, which sold over 10 million copies. Sometimes, when you're starting with a piece of historical data, you need to realize that the right thing to do is to start again from base principles and rebuild your numbers from the ground up, or use a different anchor. But it can be very difficult to set that aside, because that one piece of information you have, that first piece of information, seems so important in your mind. I did an entire video about sharing as few numbers as you can, because if you have to change those numbers, especially if you have to change them down, they're going to tend to be reacted to really negatively. This happened with Anthem within the EA organization. Originally, Anthem was planned to have 5 different Javelin suit types. In addition to the 4 that shipped, the Storm, the Colossus, the Interceptor, and the Ranger, there was a 5th large size, like up at the Colossus size. It was going to be kind of a Paladin kind of Javelin suit. And that got cut, and the organization as a whole kind of freaked out about it, even though it didn't exist. In fact, nothing other than the Ranger exists at that moment. Why did they freak out? Because 5 is more than 4, and Anchor Bias said, oh no, we have ruined everything by cutting this Javelin suit. There was no information there. It was simply that anchor of the number should be 5, because 5 is the number I heard in the first place. And you can see how difficult it is to change this opinion. The team had gone through an immense amount of thinking and work and iteration to realize that it didn't need 5 Javelin suits, it only needed 4. That it, in fact, 5 was going to undermine the individuality of the Javelin suits. And by going from 5 to 4, it could actually make the suits better and more different from each other. But the people that are hearing 5 went to 4, they haven't gone through that process. And you can't really take them through that process because that involved a lot of very small scale thinking and conversation that took months. So to get someone who is an executive in a meeting where you have 45 minutes to go over the entire project, it's simply not practical. So you're sort of stuck with 4 is less than 5. Or you end up having to do something else to kind of flip it on its head, and you subdivide each of the javelins into specializations, and you have 2 sub kits for every javelin. So now you're able to say 5 went to 4, but 4 is actually 8. Does this solve the problem? Not exactly, but it does kind of make the water a little bit murky and allow people to get stuck up less in a number that ultimately doesn't affect the overall project in a significant way. So the instant you say a number, it kind of becomes the number in people's minds. And if you need to change it for whatever reason, that's going to be a weird conversation. Even if you were going up, it potentially runs into causing weird reactions. If we had gone from 5 suits to 10 suits, then you run the risk of people wondering if the suits are bad in some way. Why do you need twice as many? 5 was the right number before, right? Fundamentally, the way that you need to deal with anchor bias as much as possible is be in control of your numbers upfront as soon as you can, because whatever number is the first number in people's minds is going to tend to control the conversation. Or even better, if you can, and it's not possible in all instances, keep the number out of the conversation completely. Don't talk about how many romance options there are in your game for as long as possible. Don't talk about how many javelin suits there are going to be, or how many levels your game is going to have, or how many hours it is, or how many square feet of explorable space it has, because it doesn't ultimately matter. It isn't the way that people should be making their buying decision. So if you can keep that number from being in the conversation at all forever, that's ideal. If you can keep it out of the conversation, at least until it's relatively settled, that's pretty good. But if the number's going to come out no matter what, or be used in some way no matter what, like your estimated sales within an organization, then your best bet is to be the one that puts that first number on the table. If you can't do that, if you can't be the source of that first number, that first piece of information, then you can often end up getting stuck. To get out of that, what you then have to do is either do what I did on Inquisition and push a boulder up a mountain, or you need to do something that essentially resets the conversation, forces the person to start again with a new first number. That can be very difficult to do unless there's some way that you can fundamentally reframe the conversation. Potentially something happening externally could do that. Maybe repositioning your game could do that. Maybe resetting could do that. But the anchor bias is so strong that it can be almost impossible to do this. Even canceling your project and then starting over again, it's probably not going to be a blank sheet of paper. There's probably going to be a little bit of momentum in those numbers that will still filter through, and the anchor bias will still be there, anchoring you back to the previous iterations of your franchise. Using past information to decide what's going to happen in the future isn't inherently wrong. In fact, one of the most effective ways to predict what the weather is going to be is to simply say it's going to be exactly like it was yesterday. But over time, obviously, that's going to be wrong, because if you just say it's going to be the same for 180 days in a row, you've moved 6 months in the future, and obviously the weather isn't going to be same 6 months into the future. And similarly, with these sorts of things change, the industry changes, the reality of a project changes. So to hold on to these numbers forever and be completely immune to any additional external sources of information is fundamentally illogical and doesn't get you what you want. So yes, learn from the past, be informed by the past, but also be willing to accept new information in your decision making, because otherwise you're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. And it might work for a while, but eventually the universe will change sufficiently that your anchor is going to drag you down. The anchor bias is probably one of the most deeply rooted of all the biases. So being aware of it is good, but you're always going to fall into this to some degree. Keep yourself as open as you can to new information. Don't constantly second guess yourself. Sticking to your decisions still really important, but be aware that you are going to overvalue the first piece of information you get on a topic, and it's going to be difficult for you to integrate new information. And when you're in a big organization, the organization itself is also going to have that anchor bias that you may find yourself constantly fighting against. So what bias or fallacy do you hope I do next? Let me know that down in the comments. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have merch, which should also be linked in a shelf below this video. I'm currently wearing the 2DA Forever shirt, but there's things for everyone. Picking something up helps the channel out as well. If you found this video interesting, give it a thumbs up, because that tells YouTube that you're engaged in it and helps it spread to more people. What is the worst example of anchor bias that you committed or that you were forced to fight against? Let me know that down in the comments as well. I will see you again soon. Thank you.